hi everyone. Thank you very much for coming. I'm Des Winter. I have the pleasure of heading up the BJS as a journal and working with these fine editors, and it is an honour and a pleasure, let me tell you. I'm very grateful to Jonathan Earnshaw, who was my predecessor, who actually has put together some of these slides and indeed is one of the principal architects of the BJS Academy. Let's talk a little bit about perhaps the most important and certainly the most read part of the paper that it is that you're planning to write, the abstract. As put on the screen here, roughly 50% of full papers read only by the editor who actually handled it, the referees, of course, who do it, and the author themselves. After that, there isn't a huge amount that actually people tend to drill deep down into unless it's for a journal club or something that you're very specifically interested in your field. And in a world currently where we have millennials and post-millennials who are having information coming at them from all aspects of media rapidly, it requires that your information be in a snapshot grab. In fact, I suspect that even inside an abstract, the vast majority of people read the title of a paper and the abstract conclusion. The rest skips by. It does need to be carefully structured. We have a fairly clear process by which it should. There is a rhythm to it, an automaticity to it. I remember years ago for the centenary of the journal, the 100-year celebration in Oxford, we had a fantastic talk from someone who was a process person rather than a publishing person. And that talk, that speaker was able to put up on the screen a particular format without the text in it and able to ask the audience, what's that? And we were all able to say, that's an abstract. And then to have another section, their methods, that's statistics, even though there was actually no text in it. And that's, of course, isn't it, how the human mind works? Most of the time when you walked into this room, for example, you didn't notice the colour of the carpet. You didn't notice the texture of the carpet because that's what you expected it to be. You didn't notice the colour of the curtains. If I say it now, many of your eyes will go to it to go, he's got a good point, I wonder what they are. You didn't notice how many windows there are, you just know that there were windows. So the details tend to skip you past. And these are, of course, what magicians are able to do when they wow the audience. It's the small little things because you have an expectation preconceived what it's going to be. And if you work in editing, those preconceived concepts very easily fall into place like a symphony. So it becomes very simple to do because there is a rhythmicity to it. Getting into that in terms of writing is difficult, but there are rules to those structures, just as there are rules to when you are writing music or doing anything else in life which has that rhythm or direction. We do like it to be brief. Brevity in an abstract obviously is inherently important. People often want to put everything they can into an introduction to provide the reader with a historical perspective as to what the purpose of this is. I think most of us will get rid of that. The introduction should, by and large, state what the purpose or aim of the study was. Then we move directly into everything else in terms of methodology, etc. Completing the paper at the end of it is perhaps the hardest part. The hardest part actually, isn't it, is getting that paper and actually accepting to yourself that this is complete. It usually does require that you've worked with someone else. We use the term senior writer a lot. Of course, the person doesn't need to be necessarily senior, just experienced. I think age is not always an additional value, but someone who's experienced. It's useful very much to bounce things among yourselves because there's the wisdom of crowds, teams. You tend not to miss things if you work together in collectives like that. Don't agonize at that point. It becomes the law of diminishing returns. If it's 90, 99, 95, 94% perfect, it's perfect enough for us to be able to work with you because, as you just heard, almost every paper published was a manuscript in a different form. We have edited it somewhat, and we probably edit a lot more than most journals do. We take, not pride, but we take an interest in the quality of the paper that you read, and we take it personally if there are papers in that you are either unable to read or that you find challenging to read. It should have a clarity to it, and I think you'll all see that there is a style such that, like the symphony analogy, each paper has a particular tone, rhythm, direction, all of that is predictable every time you read some journal from the BJS stable. The submission process varies from journal to journal, of course. We've done our best to make it as simple as possible, but of course there are rules, and the compilation of your article into the PDF format requires that you fulfill certain criteria. They seem, I'm sure, quite rigid, and of course they differ from journal to journal, but there is purpose to that, and it is due to the requisites of there being a particular section by section by section. Is it possible to bypass that? Yes, but that usually requires some degree of communication with the editorial office. So most of the time you just have to bite down on the stick, set aside that hour and go ahead and do it. Managing the response from the journal is, as has already been articulated to you, very straightforward. You do it point by point, you keep it professional. If the referees have been unprofessional, you stay professional. You point out that it is unprofessional. You point out what can be changed, what is a reasonable argument to do so, what is a reasonable argument against the things that you don't think should be changed or cannot be changed, and then you leave that to the editorial decision. Authorship is perhaps the biggest challenge in terms of the interpersonal aspects of surgical publishing. The best way to do it is to have it defined in advance who it's going to be. I often told my younger colleagues when I was in my training years that the best way to give a manuscript to the boss was without any names on it. Why? Because all people did was go to that front page and fixate upon where their name was on the page, which shows you a lot about human behavior. Very little about the science and where they came on that. And that's one of perhaps the tragedies of publishing is that becomes the fixation. We have lessened the stranglehold on that to the point that we have increased in my long, I suppose, but relatively short time working in surgical publishing, about 15 years, we've gone from having a word limit or an author limit of 6, then to 8, then to 10, and now we actually have just banished the whole concept of there being an author limit. As long as it is reasonable and people fulfill authorship rules, and I don't think we're going to get into the absolute specifics, but one does need to have participated in the fundamentals of design, execution, interpretation, writing in order to be an author. It's got even more complicated in the modern world with collaborative research, and I don't need to tell those of you who are young enough to want to listen to this or to be in this room, this course, I don't need to explain to you what that is because you're all very familiar with collaborative research. We like collaborative research, we like the idea of it, we like the idea of grassroots, and therefore we are prepared to be lenient in terms of the concept of authorship in that context where it comes under collaborators. Currently, as you know, they're all eventually Indexus Medicus. They go on PubMed. Will that always be the case in the future? It's difficult to know because these are changing times. But for the moment, that is currently how it works. I'm not offended at that. I'm not offended at that as a concept. I think it's important. It does get into ridiculous when you have as many authors as you have patients. And where that's the case, one often has to ask them to rationalize or to reconsider what it is that they do. Acknowledgements are particularly helpful at the end of the manuscript if you want to acknowledge someone who does not wish to be an author, has not participated enough in it to be an author, but it is nice to be nice. And this is a space kept for thanking not every single person in the audience. You don't have to thank the person who held the door open for you that morning in the hospital, but it is nice to be nice, and it is nice to include some of the people who otherwise would not be included. Editing, for the most part, is left to us. The senior author on the paper takes responsibility for the accuracy, veracity, etc. of the text as it is written. But I must say, I would not encourage people to over-edit their paper at that stage. It's pointless. And the idea of sending in something perfect such that it isn't going to be changed is probably a waste of your time at that particular stage. Probity, we'll talk about in a moment. So the ICGME have particular rules in terms of authorship. I've just touched on it a moment ago. The conception, design, acquisition, analysis, interpretation of data, etc. Drafting the work or revising it, etc. Final approval, and of course, agreement to be accountable, and that's the most important part of this slide. It's not what you did, it's that you must understand that you are accountable. Be careful, beware of the person who sidles up to you in the corridor, offers to put you on a paper. You've had nothing to do with it. I personally tend to say, it's okay, I don't need another paper, thank you very much. Because the problem is, if you've not participated in it, and it does turn out to be in any way inaccurate, or worse, manufactured, then your reputation is tarnished. You can't afterwards say, oh, I didn't know this, because your name's on it too. So be very, very careful what you do. In an ideal world, those designated authors on a paper will have contributed to each aspect of that. They are the rules, and of course, like all rules, they are bent a little bit. They are played with a little bit, and we will accept that, you know, not every senior author, for example, has actually got heavily involved in the data acquisition, but one assumes has involved themselves heavily in the data analysis, for example. This is difficult to read, but it just goes into some aspects of collaborative research. This is just an example from one particular group, which is the Global Surge Group, and I think there were almost 1,500 collaborators, which is an extraordinary number of people to try to get through. And make no mistake, this is an enormous amount of work for the people who work behind the scenes in the publisher, because each of those has to be input, and each of those then has to be picked up by the Indexus, Medicus, PubMed type machines in order for them to actually be accredited. So it is a huge amount of work. I think the days of this are probably numbered. I don't think this will be, there's a prediction for you in 10 years' time. I cannot see how these numbers will continue to explode like this, because it has been exponential. I think we're going to have to rationalize how we actually manage to do that, and we are constantly streaming and changing the way in which this is done. We had a paper recently in the journal where the authorship collaborators went through 5 pages. You know, it's an extraordinary thing. And to get all of that correct, and inevitably when you have that many people, somebody feels left out, or you got the wrong, you spelt their name wrong, or you got the wrong derivation wrong, or culturally, as you can imagine, there are some parts of the world where people have 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 names, or several letters and forenames where you can get that incorrect. So be patient with us. Look at that. It goes on and on and on and on. It actually goes right the way down to the floor and then some. So, plagiarism. Now, plagiarism, it's an interesting word. Unreferenced use of anyone else's published or even unpublished ideas, grant applications, anything of those nature, anything in words or indeed in spoken words, technically could be plagiarism. Believe it or not, you can plagiarize yourself. You can be guilty of that. We had that a few years ago where there was a submission in which large segments of the text had been lifted from a previous publication from those authors. And the senior author could not understand that that was plagiarism, could not understand that that's publication misconduct or attempted publication misconduct, because you can't do that. And The author quite rightly said to me, but I cannot write the same thing differently because it's the same phenomenon. I said, I understand that, but equally, you cannot cut and paste. Why? It's not your work. The moment you publish something, actually you sign over a thing, you sign a copyright agreement. It is now owned, so to speak, by the publisher. They were your words, and you own your words, and you're responsible for your words. But the text on the page cannot be repeated exactly as the text on the page. And one should find new ways to write the same thing. And of course, the final comment that I had to make to that particular author was, if it has been said already and you're copying and pasting, then it is, by definition, redundant, not required. And where that's the case, we shouldn't publish it. And that, of course, closed that chapter. So be careful of that.
This is very difficult in basic research when you have a big collaboration on one big study, out of which comes, I don't know, several publications. The methodology is similar or same. And that makes it difficult, right? I have done a big study that was performed, and I have several, and I did have numerous examples of that.
We get around that by saying the methodological aspects of this study are almost identical to that as has been done previously, open brackets reference that paper, close brackets. In brief, this is the following. There's no need to repeat the whole thing. So there's a good example of where that's not redundancy in a malignant way, but in order to avoid benign redundancy, we would encourage you to reference the previous work and not repeat it in this. It makes it clearer. Short and brief. So rules of plagiarism, things that one can do, aspects of things. You can directly quote, of course, patchwork, as we've just discussed, pulling something in and sticking it in, even paraphrasing. Tables, figures, diagrams, and pictures, believe it or not, we have had that happen before. What you should do if you're using someone else's table or someone else's figure or someone else's illustration is get permission from the publisher, not from the author, from the publisher. And 99 out of 100 will say, no problem, we will agree. And then at the bottom of it, you should say, published with the permission of. You've just touched on something which we're not keen on, which is where a large body of data is aggregated and people sit down from the beginning to decide or to determine that they will cut that up into lots of little sections in order to multiply the number of publications from that data. Whilst we all understand the reasons why that may be done, including that there's too much to put in one, but it's usually because people are trying to get as many papers out of it as possible, it's sort of disappointing, and it's not really how things should be. We should celebrate in surgery not the size of the CV, but the quality of the CV, the quality of the paper. And obviously we would prefer to see it in one. It has happened where we have got so much information and data in a paper that we've actually said, why don't you segregate or separate this into more than one paper? So that does actually happen, and that's where working with an editor is good. We get very few pre-submission inquiries, and yet they're extremely welcome. It takes minutes to have to read through something as an editor and to say, I like this, I like that, don't do that, do this, change that, and while you're at it, if I were you, I would take some of that information out because it just isn't needed. We'd be able to see that very clearly. Why? It's not we're no better than anyone else. It's just this is what you do on a daily basis. And when I walk into a room, I note the color of the carpet, the texture of the carpet, the color of the curtains, the pictures on the wall. Don't miss the trick. It's what you are trained to do. It's like being a detective. Revising and editing, hugely important show to all co-authors. I accept in a collaborative group that can be difficult, and I've participated in groups like that where it is hard to chase everyone to get their tacit agreement, but strictly speaking, you should do so. And this concept of sending it out and saying, we assume if you've no comments in the next week that you have no comments, actually, strictly speaking, is not the same actually revising, editing, and co-authoring in a proper way. Showing to an expert who, of course, could or could not be an editor, or has not been an editor, or has at least published papers and has a good sense, cannot be overemphasized, of course, and I think we've said that multiple times throughout the course. Spell check is important only because it irritates. It irritates referees, and of course it irritates editors, and it's so unnecessary in a modern world where you actually have word processing things. Get the language correct. If sending something to an American journal, learn how to spell in American style. At the bottom of your screen in the word processing thing, you can change the required language into whatever it is that you wish. The number of times that we get papers that are still written with in another language, if you like, than English it's slightly irritating, because it gives you the flavor that this is second-hand, that this is not the first submission. It's not the end of the world. Once again, you've got to leave your ego and hubris at the door when it comes to publishing, but it just gives the referees in particular a little distaste. And if you have to go through something as a referee, if you're a very, very diligent referee, and point out each of those spelling mistakes, it is a tremendous waste of someone's time. Instructions to authors, read them, hugely important. Read the instruction to authors. The number of difficulties and problems that we have with the submission process, by and large, is because people don't actually do that. I used to say this is a decidedly masculine thing, but I don't know is that actually true. I'm not sure there is, but by and large, it's a thing that we joke about as men. That a new piece of kit comes to the house, we open it up. The first thing is on top is the instructions to authors, or the instructions to how to use it. And what do? We throw it away. I don't need that. It'll be fine, it'll be intuitive. Well, this isn't an intuitive process. Read the instruction to authors and follow it and go through it extremely carefully. We have had visual abstracts come into us over the last, maybe 10 years. It reached a peak about 3 or 4 years ago and then slightly fell off the cliff a little bit. Some journals better than others are doing it. We welcome them. We think they're nice things to have. They're certainly a very easy visual. Regrettably, this is the diminishment of the world right down to bite-sized little bits of information, which is perhaps what's wrong with them. What's wrong with them is that it's all on one page, but that's also what's right with them, that it is all on one page. And it always reminds me of the difference between James Joyce, if you've ever tried to read it. James Joyce, according to Samuel Beckett, who was another famous Irish writer, who sort of mentored him, if you like, said that the problem with Joyce is that he tries to get everything on the page. I prefer to have everything off the page. Which would you prefer? So that's what happens. We get Joyce in with everything on it, and we wanted to go out looking like Beckett with as narrow and small a message as possible. So visual abstracts, good, but I would hate to think that we have reduced ourselves, this is sort of reductio ab in absurdo, we have reduced everything right down to just that, your paper. But do provide that for us, we would enjoy that. And of course it gives you an opportunity therefore to have your work celebrated in the social media, which is very much the modern world. That's good for you. It's also good for the reader, the information gets out there. And in terms of what I like to call post-publication dissemination, there's no finer way of doing it than with something visual. We are visual creatures. This is what the editorial process looks like. So, manuscript, I never call it a paper until it's published. The manuscript is submitted and it comes in. I read those, I go through those, and I think, okay, the content is appropriate, the scope falls into what it is that we're interested in publishing. Now, what about the content? Is the content appropriate? Is there something wrong or incorrect, or is there something frankly awful in it? If it does, then it fails at the first hurdle. At that point, it'll just be immediately rejected with a very nice email, I hope. I write a personal one every single time, it's not automated, explaining why this falls outside the scope of our current practice or interest, and very best of luck, and I'll usually suggest what to do with it and where to send it. If it does get through that phase, it's then assigned to one of the editors, and that typically is according to the subspeciality interest that that editor has. And of course, there's some that fall into general, and some of those we would share among us. It then goes for peer review in the sense that it is sent out to referees. It does happen that the subspecialty editor feels this is not good, is redundant for a particular reason, or does not fall inside a particular world in their particular specialty and a direction in which this is going, or feels that it is premature, for example, that more work could be done. That usually, because of that subspecialty editor's particular interest and personal understanding of that particular literature. Where that's the case, we discuss it among ourselves, and where that's the case, once again, the authors get a nice letter and a suggestion that this might be best maturely thought of again. If it does go out for peer review and it does go to referees, and we would typically pick at least 3, and we would be looking to get at least 2 opinions back. If they are favourable, we will then work with them. If they're unfavourable, they've actually got an unfavourable score with unfavourable comments, and do bear in mind as an author that there is an extra box that we see which is comments to the editor. That's where the referee tends to be the most honest, and what you see in the comments to the author tends to be a polite, watered down version of the actual opinion. So if it does fall inside that, then of course regrettably it can be rejected. The simple mechanics of journal publishing are that you have a set number of pages in a year that you can publish. You can only publish this quantum of work. And where that's the case, if you have this many submissions, then that's the rejection. That's what gets published, the rest get rejected, and that's just life. Rejection is a terrible word, I think, personally, because it's not actually rejection. It's just that you weren't selected. It's a little bit like the nightclub analogy that we were discussing last night with the guy with the red rope who opens the rope and lets you in or not. If you don't get in, it's not really a rejection. It just doesn't work in that particular time for that particular moment. It's as simple as that. It usually doesn't mean that the work is awful. It just means it doesn't fit inside the category of what it is that we are interested in, and we would like to hope that we can pick the best work. That's unfortunately the challenge of publishing, and the trick is to pick it, and we don't always get it right. And I suspect each of us, once a year, rejects a paper that probably could have worked well, and some of them, of course, end up in other journals, and some of them end up in other journals with more prestige or higher impact factor or whatever it is that you consider to be important in your world. So we do get things wrong.
What's the ratio from peer review to acceptance? Are we allowed to know that?
Yeah, sure, the ratio, like what's the number?
Yeah.
The percentage?
Proportion.
Oh, proportion. We are currently just under 10% acceptance, roughly. That changes, of course, according to how much work that you have that's invited. How much work that you have is solicited, if you like. But it's roughly around about 10%, and I think that's probably the same for most journals. BJS Open is perhaps a little bit higher because of the process where we're already screening them and saying, you know what, this is good work. It's into the next 10%, so it should be published. It should be published somewhere. We don't have space for it, but it definitely should be published, and that's the sort of work that we, if you like, pass over if the authors wish it to happen to BJS Open. Open access is probably the way many institutions are going to want to go, and where that's the case, we've been happy to provide people with an avenue like that for them to do it, either in BJS or in BJS Open, which is primarily open access, but it is possible to do open access in either. I think people misunderstand the concept is that just because it's author pay, it doesn't mean that author chooses. That, of course, is the regrettable side effect of there being very avaricious, greedy, open access journals who are just looking for work in terms of the money. We've certainly stayed very clear of that. But the difficulties and challenges of publishing do require there to be a process, and like all processes, that has a cost associated with it. So that's roughly the number, about 10%. I would say roughly 5 to 10% are probably rejected from the onset. So you're talking about roughly 90% peer reviewed, and of those then about 85% of those accepted, roughly. Mathematics was never my strong point. So resubmission, do follow the instructions for revision. There will come with your paper instructions for revision, and pay in particular heed to the comments made specifically by your editor, less so what the referees suggest, because we don't want you to do exactly as the referee said. We just want you to have alluded to it and accepted or rejected what it is that they say. And where there is conflict between a referee and the editor, you can imagine who it is that you think you should listen to. Listen to the editor, who is working with you, not against you. Don't, of course, give up if your manuscript is not accepted. Let's not use the R word. If it is not accepted, don't give up. Don't worry about it. It is likely that it can be worked into something somewhere, and if you wish to do so, you'll find that most editors of most journals will give you a personal slant on it if they haven't done so in the letter, which is informing you that regrettably we are not accepting it on this occasion. There's usually a reason, if you're open-minded. Just before the pandemic, probably about 2.5 years ago, we started the concept of trying to aggregate a community of early career researchers, early career readers, from medical students upwards. I started reading that journal in my late medical school years. I never actually thought I'd get involved with it, actually. So be careful what it is that you dream about, or be careful what you wish for. But to get that type of grassroots involvement, because they are part of our readership, but they tend not to have a voice, and they tend not to have an ability to write, particularly at the earlier stages. So to really get that engagement and involvement, and their feeling that they actually do form a very valued part of that community, we aggregated people into a group called Young BJS. It's perhaps not the most ideal title for something, but it worked just at that time, because of course, what does young mean? Young is usually 15 years younger than the person, by age, younger than you are at that particular time. But this doesn't actually mean youth in terms of age. I had to answer that 1,000 times. No, it doesn't have an age category. It has more to do with one's earlier career. So this would be for everyone right up until their early faculty years. That's approximately what we want to put into a cache, if you like, in terms of CACHE, in terms of their ability to interact with us, to interrogate us, and to identify for us things that they wish to see in the journal, give them a seat at the table, if you like. And then, of course, it is a condensed field where we can inform them of something which is particularly relevant for those early career times, and less relevant for those like me who are in a more established position. We're sort of delighted to see how many people all over the world. I haven't updated that map now for a while, but you can see within a matter of weeks we had thousands of people in every corner of the inhabited world. I've yet to get Iceland, and if there's anyone listening to this online, I want you right there. We haven't got Iceland as yet. I also want Madagascar as well, as you can imagine. And then there's parts of Japan and the East that we would love to see a little more engagement with. But you can see this is clearly something that people are excited about. They're delighted to be asked. Having done that, that sparked the initiation of us thinking, wow, we've always had a cornerstone of what it is that we do in publishing as direct education. Typically, we've done it like this in rooms where a group of us would discuss, educate, inform, infotain you for a little while and get back from you what you do. But it was never any more than 40 or 50 or 60 people in a room at any one time. And if you think about the dynamics of that, you can't even do a single medical school in a reasonable quantum of time, let alone all of the multiple medical schools all over the world. this gave us an idea that, ooh, I think actually we have come to the point where electronic virtual education and paper publishing have actually now crisscrossed. And just as paper publishing is about to fall off the page, electronic education in terms of a journal publishing became something which we really should do. And that's how wonderful the power of these young people signing up have done. From that, it is a pleasure to say that the BJS Society, who are the charity that own the journals, BJS and BJS Open, are going to put significant funding into the development of a BJS Academy. It is a virtual platform for education and information in a surgical field and all aspects of surgery and surgical processes. It is ambitious, it is engaging, it is going to be, for the most part, free to access, and almost all of the content in it will be free for anyone, anywhere in the world. And of course, from many parts of the world, this is how that type of information, particularly in low and middle income countries, is likely to be on small devices. So it is device friendly, it is people friendly. We will endeavour to have it in language which will make it more penetrable and more accessible in some parts of the world. No reasonable request from any part of the world will be declined in terms of translating it into how it is that they wish it to be. Courses like this will form part of the educational aspect, which will be didactic, but of course there will be interactive, entertaining, both content from the journal which is of scientific merit, and then also content from aspects of the non-scientific aspects, like the blog that we started a few years ago, which is the Cutting Edge blog, where it is more opinion-based rather than necessarily scientific-based. So it's tremendously exciting times. What a wonderful time we live in to see something like that happen, and to have that actually free, I think, is tremendously transformative for electronic education and surgery. And I have to say, I'm certainly very happy and pleased that I've had any aspect of the initiation of that, but all of the credit should go to those in the BJS Society, the architects of the BJS Academy, and the person who's leading that at the moment, of course, is Jonathan Earnshaw, who unfortunately wasn't able to be with us today, but I do think it's worth mentioning, particularly as I'm using his slides right now. Thank you very much for your attention and for listening. Any questions either in the room or out? We're delighted to answer them.